Good evening. This is a story of a woman called Úna McStirret. Now, Una was her town's local midwife. Every evening, she would sit by her fire and read the letters and the cards of the women that she'd delivered babies for over the years. Una didn't have a child herself, but she was more than happy to be part of other people's happiness. One evening, around midnight, Una was woken by a knock on her door. When she answered it, there were 3 women standing there. But a midnight call like this, not unusual in Una's line of work, so she simply grabbed her bag and set off with them, no questions asked. But as the night air began to wake Una up a little, she realised that she'd never seen these women before in her life. She had no idea where they were taking her. As they walked her through the village and into the back of the Brady estate, where everyone in the village knew that there was a fairy hill. Una felt the ground shifting underneath her feet as they walked through the field, and the women closing in around her, so that all she could see in front of her were the backs of 2 of the women walking in front of her, leading her, and all she could feel were the eyes of the one woman behind her boring into her, until they stopped. The 2 women in front of Una parted, and she could see a door set into the fairy hill in front of her. The door opened, and Una went into a small, plain room with a basin of water, a table with every instrument Una could need on top of it, and a bed. And on that bed was a young fairy woman, pale but calm, and standing beside the bed was an older fairy woman who looked about Una's age, but was probably as old as the ground they were standing on. They didn't say anything to Una, but Una knew she had a job to do, so she rolled up her sleeves, opened her bag, and got to it. And the delivery went well. The baby was delivered safe and healthy. Afterwards, Una swaddled the baby and held it in her arms, and the older fairy woman beckoned her over, gave her a small jar of a paste that Una had never seen or never smelled before. And the older fairy woman told her to dip her thumb into it and spread it along the eyelids of the baby, which she did. And then the baby was swept from Una's arms and given to the young mother in the bed for the first time. This brought a tear to Una's eye, as it always did. And Una wiped this tear away from her right eye with the thumb she had used to wipe the ointment. And when she opened this eye again, everything had changed. For this ointment allowed the fairy baby to see the world as the fairies do, to see the other world. So when Una opened this eye, everything had changed. Where before she was in a small, plain room, now the room was huge and ornate and golden and perfect. Before, where there was just Una, the young fairy mother, and the older fairy woman, they were now surrounded by hundreds of people, including the 3 fairy women who had brought Una there. And just as she had been brought there, she was brought back to her home. The sun was rising as Una finally arrived at her home, which didn't look how she had left it. It was standing straighter in front of her. The house was, her fence was mended, the flowers in the garden were in full bloom. She turned to thank the 3 fairy women for walking her home safely, but they had disappeared, which Una felt, made sense for the night that was in it. She went into her house and she saw the cupboards were heaving with food. There were stacks of turf by the fire. Una realised this was all a thanks to her from the fairies for delivering this baby safely. She fell into her bed, slept the whole day through, and when she woke up, she knew that what happened that night wasn't a dream. It had been real. It had happened. But she decided it would be best if she kept it to herself, against her instincts. The weeks passed, and that fairy baby was far from Una's mind. She didn't have a card or a letter from this unusual young mother like she did the other mothers, but her flowers were still in bloom, her cupboards were still heaving with food, even the pains in her back and her shoulders were gone. And wasn't that thanks enough? One day, Una decided to go into the village, into the market, and she sets off from her house. And as she's walking down the road, she can hear a horse and a cart coming up behind her. She turns to look at the driver, and who is it but a young fairy man with a cold and unnatural beauty. And before Una even realises what she's doing, she calls out to him, "If you're going to the village to the market, can I have a lift, sir?" The young fairy starts and pulls the reins of the cart to stop it. He stares down at Una, as if he's seeing straight through her, as if he can see her whole life through. "Which eye is it?" Una can only point to her right eye, the eye she wiped with the ointment that night of the fairy birth. The eye that could see the other world, the fairy world, whereas her left eye could only see the human world as before. And quick as a flash, the young fairy leaped from his cart down on top of Una, knocking her to the ground with an elbow at her throat and long, gnarled green nails. He dove his hand into Una's eye and plucked it from its socket, Una writhing and screaming in pain below him. He leapt up back onto his cart, leaving Una there, screaming and crying and weeping, clutching her eye socket with her eye. Clicked the reins, clicked for the horse, and set off, rolling Una's eye between his fingers. So now, not only could Una never see the other world again, she could only see half of her own human world too. At this time of year, we get a little curious about what lies beneath the veil or what creeps in the other world. We try to test the boundaries of our world and theirs. But I think I can speak for Úna McStirret when I say, be careful what you wish for. Good night.